Vivian Hale placed the document on the table. Her office faced the garden live oaks older than the Republic framed in floor-to-ceiling glass. Garrett Sinclair stood in his maintenance uniform, grease under his fingernails, staring at the 14-page packet. "Standard waiver," she said. "Every employee signs." He turned to page 9 and stopped. His finger rested on a clause no maintenance worker would need to read. Vivian did not look at him, but her breathing changed. He signed. 6 months later, Douglas Hale's attorneys would discover that the paper made Garrett Sinclair the sole beneficiary of her entire estate. 6 months before that morning in the glass office, Garrett Sinclair had already been the maintenance supervisor at Hale House for 2 years. He lived with his 8-year-old daughter Nora, in a small whitewashed cottage at the edge of the estate grounds, tucked behind the camellia hedge where the service road curved toward the Wilmington River. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, a screened porch with a ceiling fan that wobbled past the second speed, and a view of the east garden that most guests at the corporate retreat center would have paid a premium to wake up to. Garrett and Nora paid nothing. The cottage came with the position. Every morning followed the same quiet architecture. He woke at 5:15. He checked the irrigation valves in the east garden before the Savannah heat made the ground too soft to work. He tested the pressure at each station, cleared the sediment traps, and replaced any emitter heads the tree roots had nudged overnight. By 6:30, Nora was sitting on the porch step in her school uniform, eating toast and peanut butter, watching him adjust a sprinkler head near the rose beds. That particular Tuesday in March, he was kneeling beside a crepe myrtle, explaining how to prune a lateral branch, when Nora tilted her head and asked, "If you cut it, does it hurt?" Garrett considered the question the way he considered everything, with patience and without condescension. "It doesn't feel pain the way we do," he said. "But it responds. It sends nutrients to the cut. It heals itself." Nora studied the branch. "So it knows something happened." Garrett nodded. "It knows something happened." Neither of them noticed the woman standing 30 feet away on the flagstone path. Vivian Hale had flown from Atlanta on the 7 o'clock flight that morning for the quarterly board meeting. She had not planned to walk through the garden or to stop, but the sound of a man explaining cellular biology to an 8-year-old with the seriousness of a university lecture made her pause behind the boxwood wall. She listened for nearly a minute before turning away. Inside the boardroom, Douglas Hale, 61, silver-haired, vice chairman, proposed a workforce optimization review. Vivian recognized the language immediately. It was a targeted reduction of the staff most loyal to her, the property managers, the archivists, the groundskeepers who had served the estate since her father's time. She vetoed it with a single sentence. "The board does not direct operational staffing." "I do." Douglas smiled but did not argue. Vivian counted the faces around the table and noticed 2 directors who had always deferred to her were now watching Douglas when he spoke. The balance was shifting, and Douglas knew it. After the meeting, she walked to the maintenance workshop at the back of the property. The boardroom lights had flickered during Douglas's presentation, a small malfunction. But Vivian did not tolerate small malfunctions in spaces where power was being negotiated. She found Garrett at his workbench, organizing wrenches by size, each aligned with the table edge, like surgical instruments. She told him about the lights. He nodded, unrolled the electrical schematic for the main house, and traced the circuit with his finger until he found the junction box that served the boardroom. Vivian watched his hands. She watched the way he read the diagram, not like a handyman scanning for the obvious, but like someone trained in document analysis, checking connections against context. She filed the observation without comment and left. That night, alone in the upstairs study, Vivian opened Garrett's personnel file on her laptop. She scrolled past the employment dates, the emergency contact, a sister named Catherine in Macon, and the background check. At the bottom of the second page, one line stopped her. Previous employer, Whitfield and Crane LLP, Atlanta. Position, Senior Associate, Estate Planning. She read it twice. She closed the laptop. She did not call anyone. 3 weeks later, Douglas made his move. At a special board session, he introduced a formal motion for a leadership competency evaluation of the CEO, meaning Vivian. His stated rationale was her refusal to liquidate 3 legacy properties the family trust held in Savannah's historic district. Douglas argued the properties were underperforming and that Vivian's refusal to sell demonstrated emotional rather than strategic judgment. He brought spreadsheets, appraisal letters from 2 commercial firms, and projected revenue figures from liquidation. 2 board members he had been cultivating for months voted with him. The motion was tabled 4-3. Vivian survived only because the board chair, a retired judge named Alderman, exercised a procedural delay. She walked out knowing she had won a skirmish and was losing the war. The following evening, Vivian sat across from Ruth Kessler in a private dining room on East Broughton Street. Ruth was 58, gray-haired, composed the Hale family's estate attorney for 25 years. She had drafted Vivian's father's will. She had structured the family trust. She knew every clause, every amendment, every vulnerability in the Hale legal architecture. Vivian set her fork down. If Douglas takes the board, he will dismantle everything, every property, every holding. He has been negotiating with outside developers for months, I am certain of it, even if I cannot prove it yet. Ruth listened without interrupting. I need a contingency, Vivian continued. Someone outside the family, someone Douglas cannot buy, cannot pressure, cannot compromise. Ruth studied her across the white tablecloth. Who? Vivian slid a personnel file across the table. Ruth opened it. She read the name, the history, the previous position. Estate planning attorney, she said quietly. Whitfield and Crane. He left the firm 4 years ago. Vivian nodded. After his wife died in a car accident on I-85. He was not terminated. He was not pushed out. He walked away from a partnership track to fix irrigation systems and raise his daughter in a cottage on someone else's property. Ruth understood immediately. Garrett had the legal expertise to comprehend any document placed in front of him, and a personal history that made him immune to the leverage Douglas wielded. Money could not move a man who had voluntarily abandoned it. Ambition could not tempt a man who had chosen obscurity. That was why Vivian chose him. In the weeks that followed, Vivian began spending more time at Hale House, citing the need to oversee the property operations Douglas was threatening. But she also, and she would not have admitted this to anyone, including Ruth, began finding reasons to walk past the maintenance workshop. One afternoon she found Garrett restoring a window frame in the east wing 200-year-old wood, hand-planed, mortise and tenon joints, still tight despite generations of Savannah humidity. A contractor would have replaced the frame in an hour. Garrett was spending 3 days working each damaged section back to stability with a chisel and wood filler. Vivian stood in the doorway and watched. You could replace it, she said. Faster. Cheaper. Garrett did not look up. It still holds. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Vivian turned and walked away, but the phrase followed her through the evening and into the next morning. A man who chose to repair what still held rather than discard what was merely old. Ruth began drafting the waiver that same week. She worked alone, after hours, in her office on Drayton Street, with the door locked and the blinds closed. She understood that what Vivian was asking her to create was the most legally precarious document of her 25-year career, a beneficiary designation concealed within an employee liability release. If it were ever challenged, it could expose Vivian to fraud allegations and Ruth to malpractice claims and potential disbarment. But Ruth also knew Douglas Hale. She had watched him circle Vivian's authority for 2 years. She had seen developers' names in correspondence Douglas assumed was private. She knew what would happen to Hale House if he won. She kept drafting. Ruth produced 2 versions of the document. The first was a standard 6-page employee liability waiver boilerplate language covering workplace injury, equipment use, insurance restructuring. Every employee at Hale House would receive this version. The second was 14 pages. It contained identical boilerplate in sections 1 through 8, but pages 9 through 11 introduced language that only a trained estate attorney would recognize: an irrevocable beneficiary designation embedded within insurance reallocation clauses, structured so that a casual reader would see nothing but policy adjustments, while a legal professional would identify it immediately as a transfer instrument. Ruth formatted both versions identically, same typeface, same margins, same cover page. The only visible difference was thickness. Vivian convened a staff meeting in the main hall of Hale House on a Wednesday morning. She stood at the front in a gray blazer, her voice flat and corporate. As part of our insurance restructuring, all employees are required to sign an updated liability waiver. Standard procedure. Please review and sign before leaving. The packets were distributed. 23 employees signed within 5 minutes, most without reading past the second page. Garrett was the last person remaining in the room. He sat at the long oak table after everyone had filed out. He opened the packet. He read page 1. He read page 2. He turned each page with the same unhurried precision he used when aligning wrenches on his workbench. At page 9, his hand stopped. His index finger rested on a clause buried in the middle of a paragraph, irrevocable beneficiary designation, pursuant to section 732.502. He did not move for 6 full seconds. Then he looked up. Vivian was standing at the window with her back to him. She had not left with the others. She had not spoken since the meeting ended. She stood perfectly still, framed against the garden light. Garrett looked at the clause again. He had drafted identical language more than 100 times during his years at Whitfield and Crane for clients in Atlanta, in Charleston, in families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. He knew what every word meant. He knew the difference between a revocable designation and an irrevocable one, and Vivian had chosen irrevocable. That was not a casual decision. That was a woman building a firewall she could not undo, and he understood something the clause itself could not convey. If a CEO had concealed a beneficiary designation inside an employee waiver, it meant she had exhausted every conventional option. It meant she had no one inside her own family she could trust. It meant the danger was immediate enough to justify the risk of criminal exposure. She was not careless. She was cornered, and she had chosen him not a friend, not a relative, not a business associate, but a man who fixed her plumbing and replaced her light bulbs because she had studied his file and concluded that he would understand the document and would not be corrupted by what it offered. He was not signing out of ignorance. He was signing because he understood what it cost her to ask. He picked up the pen. He signed his name on page 14. He set the pen down, stood, and walked toward the door. As he passed Vivian, he paused 1 second, maybe less close enough that she could hear him breathe. Then he continued without speaking. Vivian did not turn around, but her hand tightened on the window frame and her knuckles went white against the painted wood. 3 weeks passed. The signed waiver sat in Ruth Kessler's personal safe on Drayton Street, filed under Vivian's private estate documents separate from all corporate records, invisible to Douglas, beyond the reach of any board audit. On a Friday afternoon in late April, Nora was sitting on the cottage porch with a large sheet of drawing paper spread across her knees. She was making a map of the Hale House grounds, not a child's scribble, but a careful rendering, with paths drawn in brown crayon and garden sections labeled in her neat handwriting. She had been working on it for weeks, adding details each time she explored a new corner of the property with her father. Vivian was walking back from the east wing when she heard Nora call out across the courtyard. "Do you want to see my map?" Vivian stopped. She had not planned to stop, but the girl was looking at her with the unguarded directness that only children possess, holding up the paper with both hands. Vivian crossed the courtyard and sat on the porch step. Nora pointed to each section. "This is where Dad fixes the pipes. They're really old. This is the oak tree Dad says is over 300 years old. This is the fountain that doesn't work anymore, but Dad says he might fix it this summer. And this," she pointed to a small rectangle near the edge, "is our house." Vivian studied the map for a long time. An 8-year-old had cataloged the entire estate through the lens of her father's daily work, every repair, every explanation, every piece of knowledge Garrett had passed down during their mornings together. The property existed in this map not as an asset portfolio or a board agenda item, but as a living place where someone fixed things and someone else watched and learned. "This is beautiful, Nora," Vivian said, and she meant it in a way she had not meant that word in years. From the workshop door across the courtyard, Garrett watched. He could see Vivian sitting beside his daughter, their heads bent together over the map. He did not walk over, but he noticed something he had never seen. Vivian was smiling, not the controlled expression she wore in boardrooms, but a real smile, the kind that arrives before the person wearing it knows it has come. That same week, Douglas retained a litigation firm specializing in hostile corporate actions, not the family firm but an outside group, with a reputation for aggressive fiduciary challenges. He filed a formal petition with the Chatham County Superior Court requesting a judicial evaluation of Vivian's fitness to serve as CEO and a temporary injunction against her authority over family trust assets. The petition cited erratic leadership decisions and failure to act in the fiduciary interest of stakeholders. It was the legal equivalent of a declaration of war. Ruth called Vivian within the hour. Vivian received the news, standing on the upper balcony of Hale House, looking down at the garden, the same garden Nora had mapped, the same paths Garrett walked every morning at dawn. She did not panic. She did not raise her voice. She asked one question. "Has the waiver been signed?" Ruth confirmed. Vivian said, "Then we wait." That night, Garrett saw Vivian's office light still burning at 11. He had finished his evening rounds and was locking the workshop when he noticed the glow through the second-floor window. He walked to the kitchen, brewed coffee black, no sugar, the only way he had ever seen her drink it, carried it to the hallway outside her door, and set it on the floor without knocking. He walked back to the cottage through the dark garden. The next morning, the cup was sitting on the same spot, empty. Beneath it was a small piece of paper with 2 words in Vivian's handwriting: "Thank you." Douglas arrived at Hale House the following Monday with his lead attorney, a paralegal named Adler, and 2 allied board members. He stood in the front foyer beneath the chandelier and announced he was exercising his right as vice chairman to conduct a full review of the company's financial and legal records. Vivian did not object. She opened every file cabinet, every digital archive, every accounting ledger. She gave his team unrestricted access to the corporate offices, the quarterly reports, the employee records, the vendor contracts. She did this with the composure of a woman who knew the one document that mattered was not stored in any corporate system. It was in Ruth's personal safe, classified as a private estate instrument, outside the scope of any corporate audit Douglas could authorize. His team spent 3 days combing through records. They photocopied contracts, downloaded server backups, cross-referenced vendor invoices with board approvals. They found nothing irregular because there was nothing irregular in the corporate records. Vivian ran Hale Holdings with the precision of a woman who expected scrutiny. Every transaction was documented. Every approval was countersigned. Douglas's team spent 72 hours looking for a crack in the foundation and found solid concrete. On the second afternoon, Douglas walked through the maintenance yard on his way to the garden wing and saw Garrett replacing a section of copper pipe near the greenhouse. Kneeling in the dirt with a torch and solder, Douglas turned to the paralegal beside him. "Who is that?" Adler checked the roster on her tablet. "Garrett Sinclair, maintenance supervisor, 2 years on staff." Douglas glanced at Garrett for approximately 2 seconds, the amount of time a man like Douglas Hale devotes to people he considers beneath strategic consideration, and continued walking. He did not ask what Garrett did before Hale House. He did not look at the personnel file. A maintenance supervisor was furniture to a man focused on the boardroom. That Thursday evening, Vivian came to the workshop with no work order and no pretense. She walked in, sat on a wooden stool near the far wall, and watched Garrett work on the antique wall clock he had removed from the main parlor weeks earlier. Its mechanism was frozen. Its hands stopped at 4:17, a moment preserved in brass and springs, waiting for someone patient enough to find the fault. He was disassembling the escapement with a set of jeweler's tools, his fingers moving with a precision that belonged to a different profession than the one he currently held. Neither of them spoke for 10 minutes. The only sounds were the clicking of metal against brass and the distant chorus of cicadas outside. Then Vivian said, "You know what you signed, don't you?" Garrett did not stop working. "Yes. And you signed it anyway." He set down the tool and looked at her directly, not with an employee's deference or a stranger's guardedness, but with the steady attention of someone who had already made a decision and was at peace with it. "Because I understood why you needed someone to sign it." The silence lasted long enough to count. Vivian stood. She walked to the door. Her steps were slower than usual, and she paused at the threshold, a half-breath, barely perceptible, before disappearing into the late afternoon light. 2 days later, while cataloging the employee waiver files, Adler noticed a discrepancy. 23 packets were 6 pages each. One was 14. She pulled Garrett Sinclair's file, counted the pages twice, flagged it, and brought it to Douglas's lead attorney that evening. Douglas called an emergency meeting with his legal team. His attorney read the 14-page document line by line at a conference table in his Savannah office. At page 9, He set his coffee down and reached for a highlighter. At page 11, he removed his glasses. "This is a beneficiary designation," he said, "irrevocable. It names Garrett Sinclair as sole beneficiary of Vivian Hale's personal estate, including her controlling interest in Hale Holdings." Douglas stared at him for 5 seconds. "She gave everything to the maintenance man." The attorney shook his head slowly. "She structured it so that if her position is removed or she becomes incapacitated, he inherits everything. Personal assets, equity stake, voting shares." Douglas's expression moved through 3 stages: confusion, comprehension, and cold fury. He summoned Ruth Kessler to his attorney's office the next morning. Douglas stood at the head of the conference table, flanked by 2 lawyers, pointing at a printed copy of the waiver. "This is fraud," he said. "She used a groundskeeper as a front. She manipulated an employee into signing a document that transfers her estate to someone with no connection to this family." Ruth sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. 25 years of practice had given her a particular composure that volume could not breach. "Every clause in that document is legally valid," she said. "Vivian has full authority over the disposition of her personal assets. The beneficiary designation complies with Georgia Estate Code. You have no standing to challenge it." Douglas slammed his palm on the table. "He is a janitor." Ruth did not flinch. "He is a former senior associate at Whitfield and Crane LLP, where he specialized in estate planning and trust litigation for 9 years. He read every page of that document. He understood every clause, and he signed it voluntarily, with full legal competence." Douglas opened his mouth. Then he closed it. For the first time in his 2-year campaign against his niece, he had no response. But Douglas adapted. Within 48 hours, he shifted strategy. If the waiver could not be attacked on procedural grounds, it could be challenged on the basis of undue influence, the legal doctrine that a person in authority had exploited a personal relationship to execute a fraudulent transfer. He did not need to prove the document was defective. He needed to prove that Vivian and Garrett were personally involved, that their relationship went beyond employer and employee, and that Vivian had used that closeness to manipulate the outcome. Vivian called Garrett to her office the following morning. She stood behind her desk, the garden visible through the glass behind her. "Douglas knows about the waiver." Garrett stood near the door in his work clothes. "I knew he would find it. Are you concerned? You should be concerned. I am just the one who signed." Vivian studied him. In 2 years of running Hale Holdings, she had been surrounded by people who wanted something: board members wanting compliance, Douglas wanting control, vendors wanting contracts, attorneys wanting fees. Every relationship was transactional. Every conversation weighted with agenda. And now a man in a maintenance uniform was standing in her office, with no personal stake in her fortune, no interest in rescue, no agenda beyond the facts. He was not protecting her. He was not positioning himself. He was simply standing in the same room with the same truth. "I am not used to that," she said quietly. "To what? Someone who does not want anything from me." Douglas hired a private investigator. Over the following 2 weeks, the investigator documented everything: Garrett carrying coffee to Vivian's hallway at night, Vivian sitting in the workshop watching Garrett repair the clock, Nora showing Vivian her garden map on the cottage porch, their heads close together over the drawing paper. The photographs were compiled into a leather-bound dossier and delivered to Douglas, who presented them at an emergency board meeting with the gravity of a prosecutor entering physical evidence. "This is undue influence," Douglas declared, spreading the photographs across the conference table for all 7 board members to examine. "A CEO conducting an undisclosed personal relationship with a subordinate employee and transferring her entire estate to that employee. This is not governance. This is manipulation." He straightened his jacket. "I move to suspend Vivian Hale as CEO, invalidate the beneficiary designation, and appoint interim leadership pending a full investigation." The room divided along predictable lines. 4 members examined the photographs and saw what Douglas intended them to see. 3 looked at Vivian, who sat motionless at the end of the table, and waited. The preliminary count was 4-3 in Douglas's favor. Vivian was losing. Then the boardroom door opened. Garrett Sinclair walked in wearing a charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie, no maintenance uniform, no grease under his nails. Ruth Kessler had arranged his entry through the board secretary, a procedural allowance for individuals with material interest in matters under review, and she stood behind him near the back wall. Garrett carried a leather folder. He walked to the table, set the folder down, and opened it. "My name is Garrett Sinclair," he said. His voice was calm, pitched at the register of a man who had spent 9 years presenting legal arguments in conference rooms where the stakes exceeded his annual salary by orders of magnitude. "I am a former senior associate at Whitfield & Crane LLP in Atlanta, where I practiced estate planning and trust litigation. I have prepared a 40-page analysis demonstrating that the beneficiary designation in question pertains exclusively to Vivian Hale's personal assets, which fall outside the fiduciary purview of this board. Under Georgia Code Section 5.3.122, a trust beneficiary designation executed with full capacity and voluntary consent is enforceable regardless of the beneficiary's occupation, compensation, or personal relationship to the grantor." He paused and looked at Douglas. "I drafted instruments of this nature for families whose estates exceeded the Hale portfolio tenfold. I can tell you with professional certainty, you have no legal basis for this motion." Douglas stared at him. "Who the hell are you to sit at this table?" "I just told you." The room was silent. Vivian had not spoken during the entire exchange. She had not defended herself. She had not defended Garrett. She simply watched him, and she understood something she had only suspected since reading his personnel file. She had been right to choose him, not because he protected her, because he protected the truth, and the truth happened to be on her side. The board chair, Alderman, called for a 72-hour recess to review the analysis. Douglas objected. Alderman overruled him without discussion. During those 72 hours, Douglas worked the phones. He called each board member individually in private with the same transactional offer: vote to remove Vivian, and when he assumed control, each supporter would receive the opportunity to purchase Hale Holdings equity at below market valuation before the legacy properties were sold to outside developers. It was bribery wrapped in corporate language, and Douglas delivered it with the practiced ease of a man who had been exchanging favors across boardroom tables for 3 decades. But Ruth Kessler had been patient. For 18 months quietly, methodically, without informing Vivian, she had archived a collection of Douglas's internal correspondence, emails between Douglas and 3 commercial real estate developers discussing the acquisition of Hale family properties at terms favorable to Douglas personally, pricing memos that included a consulting fee payable directly to Douglas, timeline documents that predated his petition against Vivian by 6 months. The correspondence proved what Vivian had suspected and what Ruth could now demonstrate with evidence. Douglas's legal challenge was never about leadership competency. It was about clearing the path to a private sale that would enrich him at the family's expense. Ruth delivered the file to Garrett on the second evening of the recess, in the workshop, with the disassembled clock still on the bench between them. She set the folder down without ceremony. 18 months of correspondence, she said, between Douglas and 3 development firms. He has been planning this sale since before he filed against Vivian. The petition was never about competency. It was about clearing the path. Garrett opened the folder. He read every email slowly, the way he used to read discovery documents at Whitfield & Crane, marking dates, noting participants, building the chronological architecture of intent. He organized the correspondence into a timeline. He cross-referenced each email with Douglas's sworn statements to the board, identifying 7 direct contradictions between what Douglas had told the directors publicly and what he had written to the developers privately. He prepared a summary, clean, factual, annotated with the relevant Georgia statutes on fiduciary breach, self-dealing, and fraudulent misrepresentation. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The documents spoke with a clarity that commentary would only dilute. The next morning, Garrett stood before the board for the second time. He placed the printed emails on the table, 1 bound copy for each of the 7 members. He did not raise his voice. He read the relevant passages aloud in the same measured, dispassionate tone he had once used presenting evidence at Whitfield & Crane, the voice of a man offering facts, not making an argument. He read the email where Douglas discussed his personal consulting fee. He read the timeline showing that the developer negotiations began 6 months before the competency petition. He read Douglas's private assessment of Vivian. She will not sell. She has to be removed and let the words sit in the room without commentary. When he finished, he closed the folder and sat down. Nobody spoke for 11 seconds. Back at the cottage, while Garrett stood in the boardroom, Nora was sitting on the kitchen floor with a fresh sheet of drawing paper. She had started a new version of her garden map, more detailed than any before, with cross-hatched shading for the tree canopy and tiny labels for every flower bed. Near the bottom corner, she had drawn two figures standing side by side beneath the 300-year-old oak, one tall in brown work clothes, one slightly shorter in a blue jacket. She had not written any names beside them. She did not need to. The blue was the same shade Vivian wore every week. The board convened at 9 the following morning for the final vote. 7 members seated around the oak table. One question: whether Vivian Hale would retain her position as CEO and her authority over personal estate decisions. Douglas sat at the far end with his attorneys arrayed behind him. He was confident. He believed he had secured 3 votes, enough, with his influence, to force a majority. The result was 5-2. 5 members voted to retain Vivian. Of the 3 Douglas believed he had purchased, 2 reversed their positions after reading his correspondence with the developers. They understood, with the clarity that self-preservation provides, that a vote for Douglas was not a vote for responsible governance. It was complicity in a self-dealing transaction that could expose each of them to personal legal liability. The emails had not merely undermined Douglas's argument, they had transformed the calculus entirely. A board member who voted for Douglas after seeing those documents was not protecting a family legacy, he was participating in a fraud. Garrett's analysis had given them the legal framework to justify what the emails had already made them feel. Douglas lost on both counts. Douglas stood slowly. He did not speak. He did not slam the table or raise his voice or deliver the parting threat that men in his position often mistake for strength. He collected his papers with the mechanical efficiency of a man operating on reflex. He buttoned his jacket. He walked out of the boardroom, through the main hall where 3 generations of Hale family portraits watched from the walls, through the front door, and down the gravel drive to his car. There was no dramatic exit, just a 61-year-old man learning, in the time it took to cross a room, that he had been outmaneuvered by a maintenance supervisor he had not considered worth remembering. After the room emptied, Vivian sat alone at the table. Ruth lingered in the doorway, her briefcase in one hand. "Are you all right?" Vivian stared at the empty chairs where Douglas's allies had sat, chairs that still held the faint impressions of men who had changed their minds when changing their minds became the safest option. "The waiver," she said. "I want Garrett to decide whether he keeps it or returns it." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You trust him that much?" Vivian did not answer, but the silence carried the answer. And Ruth, after 25 years of interpreting what clients did not say, understood completely. That afternoon, Garrett found Vivian in the garden. She was standing beneath the 300-year-old live oak, the one Nora had placed at the center of every map. Spanish moss hung still in the warm air. Afternoon light filtered through the canopy in broken patterns across the grass. He walked toward her and held out the waiver, the original, 14 pages, his signature dark on the last page. "This belongs to you," he said. Vivian looked at the document. "I do not want it back. I do not want your estate, I know." She paused. The garden was silent around them, no cicadas yet, no wind, just the 2 of them and the weight of a document that had held an empire together. "That is why I chose you." They stood there, the waiver between them, neither of them taking it. The moss stirred once in a breath of warm wind and went still again. 2 weeks later, the 3 of them, Vivian, Garrett, and Ruth, sat in Ruth's office on Drayton Street. Garrett had prepared a proposal. He laid it on the desk with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything he touched. The beneficiary designation, he explained, should be restructured, not held by him, not returned to Vivian, converted into a preservation trust, a legal entity that would hold Hale House as a historical landmark and community garden in perpetuity, with Vivian as primary trustee and Garrett as co-trustee. The trust would be irrevocable. The property could never be sold, never developed, never dismantled by a future Douglas Hale or anyone like him. The gardens Nora had mapped would remain exactly as they were, not as assets on a balance sheet, but as a place where things were tended and repaired and allowed to grow. Ruth read the proposal twice, her reading glasses low on her nose. She set it down and looked at both of them across the desk. "In 25 years of estate law," she said, "this is the finest solution I have ever seen." She laid out the signature pages. Vivian signed first, then Garrett. They used the same pen. The following Saturday, Nora brought her completed garden map to Vivian in the main parlor. She held it out with both hands, every path traced in brown, every flower bed labeled in her careful handwriting, the oak tree drawn larger than anything else on the page. In the bottom right corner, she had written 3 words: "Our garden, Nora." Vivian took the map with both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly at the edges of the paper. Garrett stood beside her, close but not touching. He did not speak. Nora looked at both of them, smiled the uncomplicated smile of a child who has given a gift and knows it landed, and ran out into the garden. That evening, Garrett hung the antique clock on the parlor wall. He had spent weeks restoring its mechanism, cleaning each gear with solvent, replacing a hairspring that had fatigued beyond repair, calibrating the escapement until the tick was steady and true. It was the clock Vivian had watched him work on during those 10 silent minutes in the workshop, the clock whose frozen hands had marked 4:17 for longer than anyone on staff could remember. He stepped back. The pendulum swung. The hands moved. 4:17 became 4:18. Vivian appeared in the doorway. She crossed the room and stood beside him. They watched the clock together, the steady sweep of the second hand, the quiet mechanics of something restored to motion after years of stillness. Neither of them spoke, but her shoulder touched his lightly, barely, and neither of them moved away. The waiver had been signed 6 months earlier by a maintenance worker and a CEO in a glass-walled office overlooking the garden. But the thing that was actually signed that day, the thing with no clauses, no page 9, no legal language, was a promise between 2 people neither of them had been looking for, and both of them kept it.